Hello all, and now I wanted to have a short discussion video on some thoughts I've been having. I haven't done a full-fledged theory video in quite some time, so I figured I would offer this up. And I wanted to start off by talking a bit about the left and the right as a sort of nature versus nurture dichotomy. Where you could argue that there's this sort of abstract interrelatedness of nature that we've been seeing with thinkers on the channel lately, where you could see perhaps that there's a philosophy of trying to establish what is the potential freedom, not just within the sort of self or the margins, as we'll get to, but as a sort of natural coherence within the greater order at hand, or at least a will, if you will, to have something beyond that sort of self-referential aspect and into this sort of integral cosmology of an order at hand, a sort of central orderedness, as it were. And I think from that, perhaps we could look at how historically the left and the right, from let's say maybe post World War II, of course, where you have the aftermath of the Great War and the crimes against humanity. Out of that, of course, the left has since then been the sort of historical anti-authoritarian sort of representation of the margins and its sort of protection against the atrocities of World War II. And you could perhaps say that if we were going to abstract out for the leftist, of course, in the nurturing aspect, that the sort of nurturing of the margins is really the leftist ethos, if we were to take it to its ideological end. And we've seen this, of course, and pointed it out in critiques that you sort of have this sort of social stack, if you will, the progressive haystack, where you look for the most marginalized person around, and they should be able to speak up against the sort of order, the sort of authoritarian, against their sort of freedom, if you will. But ultimately, though, of course, since it's not like we this is our goal by any stretch, are looking to, of course, try to establish something more than just opposition of this sort of nurturing, or at least rejection of it intellectually, whatever the case may be. And so the right has always been there to defer away from these sort of things. If you really look since the 60s, not much has truly changed other than technologically. Look at any Nixon speech about reestablishing order and his talk of the civilization, which is another interesting way to look at it if you want to look at it from a historical perspective, from someone like Spangler, who sees civilization, the sort of nurture, if you will, against the sort of natural cosmology or myth, if you will, that the regional peoples have, and the sort of antagonism that comes out of it. That's another way of looking at it, perhaps. And that's another interesting way is, you see many of the rightist thinkers that are thrown around today. They have that sort of agrarian appreciation that sort of want to get away from the social construction and civilization. It's not like Heidegger spent his, well, of course you could argue that it was in shame, but he spent most of his life as an agrarian, peasant on the side, really. And you can kind of see that sort of distrust, not just of the nurturing aspect of it, but the technological aspect too, as he looks in his sort of critique of technology. Again, I think that's a sort of push towards trying to find freedom within the natural order, as it were, as opposed to the nurture. And I think ordinary, the sort of representation, if you will, of the outside of the margins, the in-group, if you will, the white working class, or whatever the case may be. If it didn't, it wouldn't be successful within that sort of natural order if it wasn't so repetitious to begin with. But really, you could argue that throughout modernity, the right's obviously been on this long, rather fruitless mission of trying to push back against the latest of the nurturing of what it means to actually have a sort of democracy that doesn't differentiate necessarily between each other, and the sort of appreciation of the difference within the forms of nature. And you could say that on a psychological level, of course, that's where you get the term nature and nurture, of course. Nature is, form, nature is biology, nature is the sort of the mapping, if you will, that takes place before you re-territorialize it, if you want to look at it in a kind of postmodern cosmology. But it's out of that, though, that you can see perhaps why we need to look away from the sort of just saying we're against this or against this sort of next process within the nurturing, and more towards actually establishing nature as the forefront for what the right could actually stand for in this sort of abstract way. And I think you could even argue, as I find interesting with Hegel and how he, uses the self and the self-consciousness and the concepts of thought out of that, how you could use that perhaps towards even looking at the self as the subject ages. He's sort of in his own life tends to, of course, in pop culture at least, move towards the right over time, move towards the sort of social order that they were instantiated before, which you could argue, of course, that this is just a earlier stage of the nurturing process. But that nature and its interaction with the subject, with us and this sort of finite being, that is the sort of rightist aspect, projecting out into our own sort of phenomenon of occurring on a sort of individual basis. And I think that's a pretty interesting way to also look at this in another way. But I also wanted to kind of talk a little bit about freedom, and obviously kind of hark back to the whole the freedom of actually acting out the duty of your relationships around you towards the greater natural order at hand, if you will, that's sort of trying to find your place that is right within your life, and the people around you that you probably care about. And I think that is a more compelling way of maybe going about trying to theorize on the right, or trying to move in a political and philosophical way. Sort of renewal of nature, if you will. Since I don't necessarily think that simply trying to say, oh, we should just defer to nature and just go live in a bunch of mud huts. It's about in a way renewing freedom, more than just the freedom of choice. And I've gone over this point before on the channel a half dozen times now, but really has to do with the freedom of being able to act in ordinance with nature, as opposed to the freedom of choice to rule over it, as it were. And I think you can see that in the philosophy of history on the channel that I'm doing, where you're I pointed out that Kant, at the end of the series, a little mini series that I did, he has the philosophy of freedom, and at least in my mind, in his look at pure reason, where he's obviously sees freedom and autonomy, despite the problems with static science, if you will, at the time. He cares a great deal about trying to find that sort of universal freedom to act. And of course, it goes without saying that Kant cares a lot about duty and that sort of action of freedom, as opposed to the choice of the margin. And I think you can see this sort of really just the lack of genuineness to actually be creative anymore on this sort of left freedom of the margins and the choice of the margins. You have them handing out crack pipes now. This is what you get when you ultimately reward the margins constantly, and you've eroded away what the ordinary stands for. It's sort of a kind of Hegelian other sense, without a sort of sturdy normal behavior within a society. The margins are just, there really is no established actual margins. Trying to sort of rule with the margins in a nurturing state has alienated us away from nature, to the point where most of the Zoomers around us are having panic attacks in their room constantly. I think that's one of the more pressing issues of our time now, is coming out of this situation that couldn't have happened otherwise, without the technology of nurturing, to get us in these situations to begin with, is something to take away, I think, from this sort of ramble video that I'm trying to get home here. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoy, discuss, and consider it, and thanks for watching.